Thank you for joining us for this week's message at Crosswind Church. In the next few weeks, we will be focusing on and hearing from some individuals that serve within our church in a series called I Am Crosswind. We will learn how to serve not only by God's direction, but also through these examples and testimonies. If you have any questions about this message or about Crosswind Church, please visit our website at www.crosswindchurch.net or email us at info@crosswindchurch.net.
It's been a really neat series to work through because there's so many people that give back and serve in so many different ways. I can't tell you how many volunteers it takes to pull off what we do every Sunday and every Wednesday, and I'm so thankful for all of our volunteers that get to do that. You all already knew that I was a nerd. And today I'm going to give you a little bit more ammunition. When I was in high school and in college, I served in student government. That was kind of what I did. And I had a number of different positions and served in a number of different roles. When I went to college, it kind of went to a next level. Because in college student government, you actually kind of do some things. You serve as a liaison between the administration and the students, and you try to make the school a better place and that sort of thing. And so when I was in college, I served for 3 years on the student senate. And so there was, 100 of us or so maybe that served on this student senate. And we represented different groups on campus and different housing complexes on campus and that sort of thing. And so I did that for 3 years. My senior year, I was approached by the president of the Senate. So just like in our government, the vice president of the SGA serves as the president of the Senate. And he came to me. His name was John. And he said, Jeremy, I need you to do me a favor this year in student senate. And I was like, man, sure, whatever. That's fine. And he goes, no, I need you to be the president pro temp of the Senate. Now, I didn't even know what that was. And so it's okay if you don't know what it is. Let me explain what the president pro temp is. It basically means I'm the backup. It means that if the president of the Senate, for whatever reason, can't do his duties, he gets removed, there's some kind of email scandal or something like that, I don't know, he gets kicked out, then I get to be the guy that comes in and is the backup. That's just me. And to be honest with you, the reason I didn't know that it was even a position is because in 3 years in the Senate, we had never used the president pro temp. There was never a need to do it. And so I thought, well, this is just like an honorary title, and thank you, I appreciate it, received with honor, and let's go on and do our business. And I can remember one Tuesday night, fairly early in the semester, we met for Student Senate on Tuesday nights, and so we're gathered together, and this is one of those, it's like a big deal. Like, you don't just show up in t-shirts and shorts to the Student Senate. Like, you had to dress up. And so across this meeting hall, there's dozens and dozens of students wearing jackets and ties and dresses and closed-toed shoes and that kind of stuff. And up on the stage where the president of the Senate normally would go, there's a little podium, and then there's a table where the parliamentarian and the secretary sat. And so the time for the meeting kind of came, and we're all kind of sitting around chatting before the meeting, and the parliamentarian's there, the secretary's there, the president's not there, and it's okay, he's probably just running a little bit late. I don't really know what's going on. It's not a big deal. And so we kind of began hemming and hawing around, and 5 minutes past the hour comes, and 10 minutes past the hour comes, and finally at 15 minutes past the hour, I noticed one of the female senators who sat on the other side of the room. She was up talking to the parliamentarian. Again, I didn't think anything about it. Well, then she walks right over to me, and she looks at me in the face. She goes, hey, Jeremy. And I was like, hey, what's going on? And she goes, well, I was excited because a girl was talking to me. But regardless, I was like, hey, what's going on? And she was like, listen, you need to get this meeting started. And I went, what? She was like, no, you see, you're the president pro temp, right? And I was like, well, yeah, kind of honorary title. I don't really do anything. She's like, no, you don't understand. Like, we've got some important stuff we got to discuss tonight. I don't want to be here all night. No one else does. The president's not here. We don't know where he is. We don't know when he's going to get here. You are, and then this is the thing I want you to. You are the senior ranking official in the room. Whew. And there was that moment where I looked around the room and I went, oh, I'm the senior ranking official in the room. And here were my peers and people that I'd worked with for 3 years who were looking at me going, come on, let's go. I got to thinking about that and how small potatoes that is, right? Because in just a couple weeks, we're going to elect someone, one way or the other, who is the president of the United States. And it'll be their first time ever to be the president of the United States. And then in January of 2017, January 20th of 2017, we're going to have an inauguration, and they're going to stand before our entire nation on the Capitol steps and put their hand on a Bible, and they'll recite an oath that's been recited since the beginning of our nation. And when they pull their hand off of that Bible and they say, "So help me God," at the very end of that, at that point in time, I want you to realize this. This is just wrap your heads around this. At that point in time, that individual, he or she or whatever else it is, that individual will never walk into a room for the next 4 years where they are not the most important person in the room. Wrap your head around it for just a minute. That individual we elect will never go into a meeting where they are not the senior ranking official. They will never go into a meeting where they have someone that has more power than them, more influence than them, more authority than them. That's a big deal, isn't it? Now, here's where this is going to kind of hit us. You see, you know this and I know this about your situation. Is that there's some time in your life where you've come to the realization that you have more influence than anybody else in the room. Where you realize you have more power than anybody else in the room. You have more ability, more influence, more authority, where you've walked into the room and maybe it was a meeting, and you walked in and it was your meeting, and everybody at that meeting was waiting on you. Or maybe it's at your place of work where you're the boss, and when you walk in, everybody takes note because the boss is here. Or maybe it's a board meeting that you go to where you're the chairman of the board. You walk into the room and no one has more authority than you. Maybe it's a classroom that you'll walk into this week where there will be 20 or 30 or 15 kids that look back at you and you realize, I have more authority, I have more power, I have more influence than anybody else in this room. What I say goes. Maybe it's with your children. When you walk in to tuck them in bed at night, or in your family when they gather around the table and you look around the table and you go, look, I have more influence, I have more authority, I have more power. In some cases, if it's your child, maybe even physically I have more power, right, than anybody else here. Today, what we've got to kind of answer is when you find yourself in those situations where you recognize that you have more authority, you have more power, you have more influence than the person you're standing nose to nose with, what is it that you do then? We have to answer a question that was posed by a pastor several years ago, a pastor down in Atlanta. He made this statement, and it rhymed, and it was so catchy, and so I'll just use his statement. This is what he said. He says, "What do you do when it dawns on you that you're the most powerful person in the room?" It's a good question, isn't it? What is it that you do when you recognize that you have more authority, more influence, more sway over the situation than anybody else there? And here's why this is important for us today. You see, we are going to find ourselves in those situations this week. We are going to find ourselves wanting to serve in situations this week, wanting to apply the gifts and abilities and talents that God has given us. Sometimes our gifts and talents and abilities have given us authority. And the question is, as we serve, what do we do when we recognize I have more influence than the person I'm standing nose to nose with? And today we get to read a passage of Scripture that paints an amazing, amazing picture of a man named Jesus that we're here to worship today. And so I wonder if you'll read a little bit of that story with me. It's found in the Gospel of John, chapter 13. If you brought your Bibles with you, you can turn there. If you don't know where John is, it's okay. Go to the table of contents. It's on page 980 in my Bible, if that helps. You can also follow along on the screen. John records the last day of Jesus' life, and this is what he says. It was just before the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. We have to kind of stop here and give you a little bit of context and where we're going. This is literally the last night of Jesus' life. They're celebrating the Passover meal with his disciples. It's a meal of remembrance. They're thinking back to what it was God had done for them in Egypt. And to celebrate this meal, they go to what we call the upper room. It's a room that was on the second story. It was probably maintained by a wealthy individual, wealthy family there in the town of Jerusalem. And there he gathers together with his disciples to kind of share this meal. Now, a couple things that I want to kind of point out to you is this. Number one, it says Jesus knows this is his last hour. This is important. It's important, and we've talked about this before. Here's why it's important. When you're getting ready to go, let's say your kids get to the age where they start to kind of stay home by themselves, right? You can go to the grocery store and they can hang out at the house by themselves or whatever, that sort of thing. When you start doing that as a parent, I know this is what you do. You tell your kids, okay, I'm getting ready to leave. Here's what I need you to know. Here are the phone numbers. Here's how you use the phone. In my case, I had to teach my kids how to use a phone. Can you believe that? They had never used anything other than a cell phone. This is a house phone. This is a dial tone. They had never heard one. Anyway, regardless, I'm failing as a parent, I think. Okay, so I'm giving them these instructions on what to do. I say things like, don't let anybody in the house, ever. But Dad, what if we know them? Don't let them in the house, ever. Nobody comes in the house. You hide if they come to the... Like, we tell them those things. Okay, that's what we tell their kids. And the reason we tell them that is because we know we're getting ready to go. We want to give them a little bit of wisdom, a little bit of insight before we head out. You know what I'm saying? Jesus knows that tomorrow at this time, he's going to be in a grave. And because he's God, he knows, he has full knowledge of that. And so what he's getting ready to do, what he's getting ready to say is so incredibly important, in the same way that your last words to your kids would be if you knew you were leaving the house and leaving them by themselves. Now, here's the thing. It says that, knowing this, he loved his disciples. And I just need to tell you, this love is not a love like the world defines love, a love like a noun that you fall into, like a swimming pool, and out of like a third-story window. That's not this kind of love. This is love of being radically committed to their advancement and their well-being. Look what happens next. Verse 2. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. I'm so thankful that John took up Bible space with this verse. Because let me tell you what it tells us about Jesus. It tells us that Jesus not only had all the authority in the room, Jesus knew he had all the authority in the room. It says that God had placed all authority, everything, underneath him. You tracking with me? Now, this doesn't mean Jesus has a little bit of authority, like Jesus is kind of in charge of the disciples in that room, or Jesus is in charge of the meal there that night, or Jesus has authority over all of the Jews, or Jesus has authority over all of Jerusalem. Jesus has authority over everything. Like, let me explain what I'm kind of talking about here. When I worked at the Piggly Wiggly growing up, I had a manager. His name was Freddie Morris. He was in charge of running the store. But Freddie, he had a boss. His boss was Bill Wedeking. Bill Wedeking owned Piggly Wiggly there on Fort Campbell Boulevard in Hopkinsville. You tracking with me? So although Freddie had some authority, he didn't have all the authority because ultimately he had a boss. And you want to know what's interesting about Mr. Bill Wedeking, who owned the Piggly Wiggly there on Fort Campbell Boulevard in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, is that he had corporate Piggly Wiggly that was over him, telling him what to do. And the people like corporate Piggly Wiggly had shareholders and stockholders, and there was always some other level of authority and responsibility over somebody. Jesus didn't have any of that. He had all authority, he had all power, and the Bible tells us, John tells us, I'm so thankful, he knew it. He knew it. He knew, I have more authority, more influence, more power than anybody else sitting in this room. You tracking with? That's the scene. Now look what happens, verse 3. Jesus knew that God the Father, I'm going to read this verse again, had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist, and after that he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. When Jesus realized, I'm the most powerful person in the room, I have more influence than anybody in the room. I have more authority than anybody in the room. I have more sway than anybody else in the room. Here's what he did. He got up from the table, from a position of prominence. He took off his outer robe. He put on an apron, and he washed the disciples' feet. Now, we have to talk about this for just a minute, because this is kind of lost sometimes in our society. We don't go about washing feet today. In fact, if you came to me and went, Pastor, I'd like to wash your feet, I would go, don't touch my feet. Right? This is weird, right? But this was a very, very big part of the culture in which Jesus lived in. They wore sandals or walked barefoot. They walked around on dirt roads that were dusty, that had manure on them and all sorts of other things. And when they would come to come into a home, in the same way that you might kick your shoes off at the door of your house to keep from tracking in whatever was outside, they would have someone that would wash their feet, or they would at least provide water for you to wash your feet. It was such a menial and dirty and horrible task that Jewish servants in some cases were exempt from having to do it. A Gentile servant would be the one that would have to wash your feet, or you would have to wash them yourself. Never, ever, ever would anyone wash the feet of a servant or would wash the feet of someone that was lesser than them. In some extreme cases, you would have like a student that would wash the feet of a teacher, or a wife that would wash the feet of her husband as a sign of extreme devotion and extreme loyalty, but incredibly rare. That sort of thing didn't happen. It was looked down upon. It was a menial task. No one wanted to do it. Now, here's what I want you to understand. No one wanted to do it, but it had to be done. It had to be done. In fact, we can read other stories from both the New Testament and from New Testament culture that tells us that to not provide someone to wash the feet or to not provide water to wash the feet, that's an insult. That's a breach of etiquette. No one wanted to do it, but it had to be done. Now let me set the scene, because I can't tell you everything that happened in the upper room, but each of the Gospels tells a story about what happened out there, so I can kind of put some pieces together for you and help paint the picture. As the disciples and Jesus are going to celebrate the Passover meal, the disciples no doubt knew something was up. And they had already had discussions, and we find out later in the room, had discussions about who was going to be the greatest and who was going to sit at Jesus' right hand and who was going to be at the left hand and who was going to have more authority in the kingdom of God. And they had these debates about who was more important than the other and that sort of thing. And so because we know this type of debate and discussion went on, here's what I can imagine happened. As the disciples walk into that upper room, they look over and they see the basin of water, or they see the place that the feet should be washed, and here's what they thought. I don't want to put words in their mouth, but here's what I can imagine they thought based on their conversations. Well, I may not be the most important disciple, but I tell you what, I'm not the least important. And the person that would wash the other feet of the others, that would be the one that would be on the bottom. That would be like the lowest tier, right? In fact, knowing what we know about Judas, they might have been like, that'd probably be like Judas what would do, right? But they didn't know that at that time, right? I mean, so they walk in and they go, okay, that probably needs to happen, but somebody else is going to do that because I know for certain I may not be second in the kingdom of God behind Jesus, but I'm up there. And I'm certainly better than washing somebody's feet. And so they walked right past the basin of water in the place where the feet would be washed. And then they started jockeying for position. Did they not? All right, well, look, I think Jesus is going to sit here, and so I'm going to sit here. Okay, John might sit here because he's the one that Jesus loves. We know that. He says that all the time. And so I might sit on the other side over here or something like that. But I'll tell you what, I'm going to jockey and try to get the best position that I possibly can. Now, look, we don't do that today, do we? I mean, come on. When we go out and eat with our friends, do we or do we not go and look at the table and go, okay, where's everybody going to sit? Right? Because I want to make sure that I get it. I don't want to sit down. I want to be down here with the kids, right? Sit with the kids. No one wants to sit with the kids, right? And I know my wife's going to want to sit with her, but I'm going to want to talk to him, and so that means we got to figure it out. Look, we do that, don't we? Come on. When it's time to go somewhere, kids, when it's time to go somewhere on a field trip, do we or do we not go, oh, I wonder who I'm going to sit next to and sit by and that sort of thing. We do that. We jockey for position, and we jockey for position for ourselves. And I can only imagine that the disciples were doing that as they walked in that upper room. They saw what needed to be done. They saw the task that was before them, and yet they thought to themselves, I'm sure, somebody else is going to do that. Because that task is beneath me. So they're sitting around the table, and they're talking, and maybe they're measuring each other up just a little bit. They look around and they see that no one, in fact, has washed their feet. As the meal is beginning to be served, and as Peter's feet, nasty, dirty, nasty feet are kind of sitting in the face of John, and John's nasty, dirty, smelly feet are kind of sitting in the face of Simon, and Simon's in the face of Matthew, and so on and so on and so on. Jesus looks around and he sees an opportunity. Recognizing that he's the most powerful person in the room, this is what he does. He gets up and he does the lowest possible task. He serves his disciples by washing their feet. Maybe you've experienced that as an employee. When I was about 15 years old, my mom was running home health care companies and branches all over the country. But one particular branch she was working at was in Nashville. We lived about an hour away from Nashville growing up. And so during the summer, she said to me one summer, she said, here's what's going to happen today. You're going to go with me to work. You're going to get up. You're going to get dressed. You're not going to sleep till noon like you do every other day during the summer. And I'm going to take you into the office. And here's why. Because we work in the medical profession, and that means we have paperwork. And that means that we have stuff that we filled out on every client that our nurses see and our doctors see. We have all of the reports. And what happens is our secretaries and our nurses, they get behind in filing these things. And so we've got a tub, Jeremy, of papers that need to be filed, and we're behind. And if somebody were to come in and do an audit right now, we'd be in trouble. And so here's what's going to happen. I'm going to pay you, because you know the alphabet. I'm going to pay you minimum wage, and I'm going to bring you in. I'm going to buy you lunch. And you, from the time we start at 8 in the morning until 5 o'clock we get done, you're going to file paperwork. There is not a more boring task. I'm telling you, it's horrible. It's miserable. It's like, okay, here's this guy's name. And so we'd spread papers out all over the floor and all over the conference table, and we'd just have stacks of files, and all day long, paper cuts and all. It was miserable. It was horrible. And every now and then the secretaries, they'd get free from doing their actual other jobs, and they would come and they'd help for a little while, and then they'd have to go back and do what they do. And the nurses would come in, and they'd just add more paper onto the stack that needed to be done. And I'll never forget, my mom was running the branch. She was in charge of the branch. She had the corner office and the nice desk and all of that kind of stuff. And I'll never forget that right after lunch, this is what my mother did. In her closed-toed shoes and business dress attire, she walked out into the conference area where I was busily trying to catch her company up in filing. And she got down on her knees, and she started filing paperwork with me. And I'm telling you, as a little boy, as a teenager, let me tell you what that taught me. It taught me that there's no task that is beneath any one of us. There are none of us that are too good to do anything. My mom has modeled that for me. I can remember hearing the story of Charles Stanley. You may know Charles Stanley, director of In Touch Ministries and pastor at First Baptist Church in Atlanta. His son, you may have heard of him, Andy Stanley, right? But I'm talking about Charles. Right? Charles, there's stories of Charles Stanley who, when In Touch, would publish Bible studies and publish materials. They have to distribute them all over the world, and his warehouse people would be working just hours and hours and hours and hours. There's stories of Charles Stanley showing up at the warehouse in his blue jeans and a t-shirt, which, if you know Charles Stanley, is not very common. And he'd pick up boxes and he'd throw them on the truck and he'd pack boxes and he'd do what he had to do to get the job done. He wrote the material. He was funding the distribution of the material. It was him that put the material out, and yet he was not above going out and working with the people in his warehouse to get the job done. There was no task that was too small for him. And we could go around the room and we could tell stories about bosses that have done this and done that and gone out and served with the people in their employee, but I still don't think we would understand the gravity of what it is that Jesus has done. I still don't think that we would understand. Jesus hasn't just put on his blue jeans and t-shirt and gone to work. The closest thing I can get of to try to paint the picture of how absurd what Jesus did is this. Can you imagine Queen Elizabeth, the Queen of England? It is Queen Elizabeth still, right? She's getting on up in age. Okay, so anyway, Queen Elizabeth, she is the Queen of England. Can you imagine her finishing or watching a polo match there next to Buckingham Palace or wherever it is they watch polo matches with horses and all that, and going out to the stable in her crown jewels, in her nice queenly dress, and shoveling manure. That's absurd. That's absurd. She wouldn't do that. It's so far beneath her. Even that doesn't paint the picture of what it is that Jesus is doing here for his disciples. I'll give you one more. Imagine Butch Jones going into Neyland Stadium and picking gum off the bottom of the seats all around the stadium. Now, some of you would like Butch Jones to do that this morning. But listen, that doesn't happen, does it? That doesn't happen. Why? Because there's some jobs that are just so beneath us, so beneath people, that we couldn't even begin to imagine them doing it. That's what Jesus does. He takes aside his divinity and he serves the lowest of the low, doing the lowest of the low task. I think Paul, maybe thinking back on this moment years later, would write the words in Philippians when he said that Jesus, though being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but humbled himself, taking upon the form of a servant and becoming obedient even to death on the cross. I wonder if Paul was remembering this. Going, Jesus, when he realizes he's the most powerful person in the room, when he realizes he's the most influential person in the room, here's what he does. He puts it aside. And he leverages his authority for the benefit of those other people. He's radically committed to their advancement and their well-being. Well, he has this misunderstanding with Peter. Let's pick up the story. John chapter 13, beginning in verse 6. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Peter is slow on the uptake here. And Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you'll understand. And no, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Peter gets the cultural implications of what's going on. Jesus, no, you shouldn't wash my feet. I should wash your feet. It's the student that washes the rabbi's feet, not the other way around. And look what Jesus says. He says, unless I wash you, you have no part of me. What Jesus is getting at is this. You need to understand, Simon, Peter, there is a washing that is about to come, not when I lay aside my outer garment and put on a robe, but when I lay aside my life on the cross. And that cleansing, Peter, you have to have. That cleansing you have to come into. You have to allow me to work on your behalf. Look what Peter says. He says, then, Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. And Jesus answered, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are now clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not every one of you was clean. Verse 12. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You shall call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. But now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set for you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is the messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be, what's the word? Blessed, if you do them. Look what Jesus says. Now that I've done this, I want you to remember it. Now that I've done this, I want you to go and do like I've done. Now I want you to go and I want you to recognize that when you have been given the authority of the Spirit, which is about to come, when you are given the authority to take the gospel message all around the world, which is going to come, listen, it's right around the corner. When you receive that authority and when you receive that influence and when you have the ability to walk into meetings and make decisions about how salvation works, which is coming, here's what I want you to remember. The authority you've been given is not so you can hold it and lord it over people. The authority you've been given has been given so that you can serve them, so that you can love them, so that you can humble yourself and lift them up. And in doing so, what you do is you mirror what it is that I've done for you. And you show that you're radically committed to their advancement and their well-being, just like I've been committed to your advancement and your well-being. I got to be honest with you. We've read this. If you've been in church, you've heard this before. If you haven't been in church, maybe this is the first time. Let me tell you about us church people. We read this and we go, man, that's easy. I can do that. I can just serve people sacrificially, and I can just serve people the way that Jesus wants me to serve them. But let's be real for just a minute, man. That's hard, isn't it? You know why it's hard? It's because people are selfish. You know why it's hard? It's because people are ungrateful. People don't always say thank you. People don't always ask for help. People don't always reciprocate in the way that you think they should reciprocate. Yeah, well, I love them and I serve them, but they haven't given it back to me, and as a result, I'm done, and it's over. And it's hard, isn't it? It's hard to look at individuals and go, I'm going to serve you, and then have them spit in your face. And it's hard to go and to serve people when they don't love you back. And it's hard to go and humble yourself when all that individual does is take the power you've given them and hold it over your life. Isn't it hard? But do you want to know why that's not an excuse for us? Just look down. Do you know what happens just a few verses later in this passage? You can go home and read it. Don't take my word for it. Do you know what happens? Judas, the man that would betray Jesus, he leaves to go betray Jesus. Do you know why it's important? It's because Judas was there when Jesus washed their feet. Jesus washed Judas's feet. Wrap your head around that. The man that for 30 pieces of silver would go and turn him over to the authorities. The man that would lie about him and hand him over to the very people that would nail him to a cross. The man who had been with Jesus for 3 years and had heard him teach and had seen the miracles and had heard the parables and had had moments of intimacy with Jesus, sitting around campfires and in homes sharing meals together. That man that would betray him in the worst possible way. Jesus knelt down before Judas and he washed his feet. Just moments before he would go and betray him. See, it's easy for us to think about going and serving people as long as they're nice to us and say thank you. But what Jesus is modeling for us here is something much bigger than that, much deeper than that. It's about serving them no matter what. No matter if they reciprocate it or not. No matter if they love you back or not. No matter whether they say thank you or not. And if we're just honest with ourselves, and let's just be honest, that's hard and that stinks. And that's crummy. But that's what Jesus has called us to do. When we recognize that we have a little bit of influence, when we recognize that we have a little bit of authority, when we recognize that we have a little bit of power, when we recognize that we have a little bit of sway, we're called to leverage that for the benefit of the others no matter what. And here's what Jesus says at the very end of this. It's his words, not mine. And when you recognize it and when you do it, then you will be blessed.